Dr. Beisner, you've already talked about definitions being key and being important. Can you, first of all, define what socialism is and the worldview that's behind it so people can understand this worldview?
I'll give it a try. It's a fairly big subject, but yeah, the most formal and precise definition of socialism is an economic system in which the government owns all the means of production, and therefore the government decides who produces what, for whom, at what prices, or at what costs, using what resources. That's the most formal sort of a definition, particularly the point that government owns the resources, owns the means of production, owns all of the businesses and so on. A little wider definition of socialism is what's commonly been practiced around the world, and that's one where even if the government doesn't own the various means of production, the various businesses and so on, it nonetheless directs which businesses are to produce what goods and services, at what costs, using what resources, and for whom, and at what prices the goods and services are to be sold. That's a little less strict definition of socialism. And then actually socialism occurs kind of along a continuum from those to a sort of a soft socialism where government guides some parts of the economy, but not other parts. A major part of much socialism is intentional government-managed redistribution of wealth, where the government takes wealth from some people who have produced it and gives it to other people who have not. So this also is an element of socialism. And the socialistic, excuse me, the socialistic worldview, I think, is rooted in a basic understanding of human nature and of morality that is divorced from a biblical understanding. In the biblical understanding, human beings are made in the image of God, and we are made to be creative and productive as He is, and to reflect His own activities in the creation of the world and in His providential preservation and development of the world. We're to do the same sort of thing. And as we do that, we express who we are. We express who we are as image bearers of God and as particular ones, different from each other. The problem with socialism is that it tends to erase those differences. It sees us basically as cogs in a machine. There was a marvelous little book written back in I believe it was 1848 or 49, by the French economist Frédéric Bastiat, called The Law. This is one of very few books that I recommend to people. They should read this every 5 years throughout their lives. It's a very short one and simple to read. Most people could read it within an hour or less. But Bastiat points out that the various socialist thinkers consistently refer to people as soil, as animals to be managed, husbanded by their rulers. They really depersonalize people. And that's one of the biggest problems with socialism, is that it tends to treat us as cogs in a machine and to give the rulers authority over that machine and rob the rest of us of our responsibility and our liberty.
So it really robs us of our freedom and our liberty.
Yes, as well as of our property rights, yes.
Yeah, and would you say that the worldview behind it also is basically atheistic, and it sees man as just being morally good, and it denies really, from a Christian perspective, the depravity of man?
Well, I think if it were very, very consistent, that would be so. But historically, socialism has not been only embraced by atheistic sorts of thinkers. At the time of the Reformation, there was a movement that is typically referred to by church historians as the radical Anabaptist movement. And the radical Anabaptists, because they thought that the coming of Jesus had essentially abolished the Old Testament law, said that Christians were no longer bound by the Ten Commandments, including by the commandment regarding property. And since the commandment said, "You shall not steal," well, what this meant was that with the coming of Jesus, theft had lost its meaning and property had lost its meaning. And so they insisted that all property should be equally shared among everyone, and that people who refused to do that should be forced to it by the governments and so on. That set off what really was quite a revolution going on, not just a reformation, but a revolution, and led to the Peasants' War, a terrible, terrible tragedy. Actually, interestingly enough, Karl Marx's Capital, his manifesto for socialism, was heavily influenced by Marx's reading of the Reformation era radical Anabaptists. So this is something that one political philosopher, Thomas Molnar, referred to in the title of a book, "The Perennial Heresy." And it's something that has risen within Christian boundaries time and again throughout history. And again, the churches have realized, no, this dehumanizes people, it depersonalizes people, and it really is a rebellion against God's law. You shall not steal, even if you are the government.
So why do you think, because we see a rise today in sort of the millennial generation, maybe embracing a socialistic worldview, especially, I know not maybe here in the UK with politicians, but certainly in the US with people like, is it Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? So they have these figures to look up to. But why do you think the millennial generation has really embraced this worldview?
Well, on the one hand, I think there are all the really laudable motives about this. I think many of our millennials, especially in our time when the difference between the wealthy, especially not just the super rich, but ordinary people of middle and upper incomes in developed countries like the United Kingdom and the countries of Western Europe and the United States and so on, their wealth is so vastly greater than the wealth of so many people in developing countries. Although actually historically they have been catching up rather rapidly over the last 50 or 60 years. But many millennials and younger see that disparity. They often are led to call it an inequity, which is sad because actually what they mean is inequality, but they've borrowed a term. The Marxist movement borrowed the term inequity because inequity is actually formed from a Greek term and a Latin term meaning not equality, but actually justice. Equity is not equality, but justice. Well, but it's easy to confuse the two if we use the word inequity rather than inequality, because any inequality then can be made to appear to be an inequity, which means an injustice. So I think a lot of young people see this great disparity in wealth, and moved by compassion, they want to see that, they want to see the people at the lower end raised rapidly. And one of the easiest ways, they think, to achieve that is to take the excess, assuming that it's excess, from those who have it and give it to those who don't. So I think that's part of the motivational part in it, and you can even say that that's laudable in that there's real compassion involved. But I think there are two other things involved. One is a simple lack on the part of the Christians who should honor Scripture, a lack of awareness of how the Bible itself talks about justice, how it uses the terms for justice and just and righteousness and right. And that lack of acquaintance results in a misunderstanding of what justice is all about. But another part is a simple lack of historical perspective. And that's why I recommended to you the podcast that you mentioned a little while ago the Cold War, what we saw.
Mhm.
The philosopher George Santayana said, those who refuse to learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And many people are just too young to remember, to have known what the world went through because of an inescapable conflict between the socialist world and the free world. As is pointed out again and again in that podcast, the free world could exist, could coexist with the socialist world. But the socialist world couldn't coexist with the free world precisely because the socialist world, for a variety of different reasons, could never compete with the free world, either in terms of how much wealth was created or how widely it was just distributed, how many people got to enjoy that wealth. And so in the socialist world, if you didn't build fences to keep people in, they ran to the free world and they found life much better there. And so for that reason, the socialist world, particularly the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, with Russia at its center, but also communist China, just simply realized they had to be in a conflict designed to conquer the free world, or else their own existence would eventually simply wither away because they couldn't compete in terms of how much wealth was created and how many people got to enjoy it.
Yeah, and so we see a lot of the more socialistic politicians today maybe making lots of economic promises. Do you think that they can handle the burden of those promises, the economic burden of what they promised?
Oh, not by a long shot. And the reasons stem from the fairly obvious and simple that historically what we've seen is that socialism has never done well at lifting and keeping whole societies out of poverty. Instead, what it's really done well is take previously well-developed economies and crush them. I mean, the current obvious example of that is Venezuela, which used to be one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America and has now reached the point where the vast majority of its population is barely surviving. That's socialism in action. But there are some more complicated reasons behind this too, and one of them is one that the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises explained in his book, Socialism, a Sociological Analysis. And that's the inability of socialism to solve the basic economic question: who should produce what, for whom, using what resources, at what prices? And the reason that socialism cannot solve that problem is that because socialism doesn't allow prices to fluctuate freely, and it cannot do so because government has to control everything. Because socialism doesn't allow prices to fluctuate freely, it robs the entire economy of the information processing system that determines where resources are most needed versus where they are less or least needed. And so constantly you wind up with misallocations of resources, not actually meeting people's needs, not meeting people's demands, but instead being pushed around by the bureaucrats. So part of it's a lack of historical perspective, part of it is a lack of understanding of how economies work.
Yeah, often when you talk to people and you maybe use Venezuela or other South American countries that are very socialistic. I remember living in Brazil a number of years ago, and it had a president then at the time who was socialistic. They'll say, well, that's not true socialism. And then they'll say, maybe, look at Scandinavian countries. That's true socialism, and it works. what
the Scandinavian countries attempted sort of a halfway soft socialism during the 1950s and 60s. and they found that basically they couldn't grow their economies nearly as rapidly as did the far less socialistic, more market-oriented economies. And from the early 1970s on, they put behind most of their socialist policies. Now, they are very heavy welfare states. That is, they have a lot of government spending directed toward medical care, care for the poor, things of that sort, housing assistance, food assistance, and the like. But that's, while that I think is a small part of the larger picture of socialism, it's not the most devastating part. The devastating part is government trying to manage the whole economy and therefore destroying the information processing system that is the free, spontaneous market of people making decisions. And by the way, people will often say, well, you're talking about the market, we're talking about persons. Well, no, the market is simply persons making decisions. The market is billions of persons making thousands of decisions per person every day as to how they're going to spend their time, how they're going to spend their energy, how they're going to spend their money. That's the market. It's just persons. So the Scandinavian countries are actually, in many respects, less socialistic than, for example, the United States, because their governments don't control as much of the economy as does the U.S. government. They're just fairly top-heavy welfare states.
So there isn't a good example then of a country who's embraced socialism and actually thrived. It's all devastating.
No, not through all of history. Now, neither socialism nor capitalism has ever existed in absolute purity. And so, some people will say, well, you're just attacking socialism in places where it wasn't proper socialism. Real socialism would have worked better. Well, the problem is there's no example where it has done better. And likewise with capitalism, people will say, yes, but you do have regulations on, for instance, limiting false advertising, actually prohibiting false advertising. You have regulations on pollution emissions, things like that. And so capitalism isn't absolute laissez-faire, isn't absolute hands-off. So everything occurs across a spectrum. And what we find in careful economic research is that total economic production and the spreading of it to as many people as possible tends to be maximized in those countries with that fall the farthest toward the capitalist end of the spectrum, and the greatest problems with poverty, not only in terms of the how wealth is distributed, but also in terms of how much is produced in its entirety, tend to happen in those countries that fall toward the more socialistic end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Before we switch gears, Dr. Beisner, let me just remind people who are watching, there's a lot of people watching, if you have any questions about the topics, that subjects we've been bringing up, please do put a comment in the comment section, and we can try and get to some of them. I can see someone obviously has mentioned that they're watching from Chile, so that's good to have you joining us this evening. But Dr. Beisner, I have, and you'll know people who maybe are Christians and say they can be Christians and embrace a socialistic worldview. So do you think the Bible teaches equality through the redistribution of wealth?
No, I definitely don't. Now, I'll mention that while I was doing my PhD work in Scotland at the University of St. Andrews, I actually knew a pastor who once said to me, well, of course I'm a socialist. I'm a Christian, aren't I? And so encountering people who think that socialism and Christianity are compatible is not all that unusual. And what I think typically is the explanation for that is just simply a lack of real study of the fundamental principles of economics. But let's move to What was the latter part of your question?
Well, does the Bible teach equality through the distribution of? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there are those who will say that it does, and they appeal to a certain number of Bible passages, typically, to do that. We can start in the Old Testament with the sabbatical year law and the Jubilee year law. The sabbatical year law is discussed in a number of different places, but especially Deuteronomy chapter 15. And there we're told that the law instructed the Israelites that in every seventh year, the sabbatical year, they were to let drop. That's a literal translation of the Hebrew verb there. They were to let drop debts that their neighbors owed to them and not collect those debts. Now, some people have argued that this is a permanent cancellation of the debts. But I think that's a very bad mistake, even though it's a mistake that's written into the New International Version translation, which chooses the word cancellation. But it's a mistake because of two things. First of all, the Hebrew word itself doesn't mean that. It's a very simple word to let something drop, and it doesn't have any implication of whether that's a permanent or a temporary thing. And in fact, if you follow the use of that word throughout the Old Testament, more often than not, it's the context makes it very clear that it's temporary. But second, and even more important, in terms of the use of that verb in sabbatical law related to the Sabbath, we're told back in Exodus, I believe it's 22:11, might be wrong on that, but that in the sabbatical year, the Israelites were to let drop their agricultural land. They were not to cultivate that land during the sabbatical year. Now, clearly, that wasn't a permanent relinquishment of the land, so that it would be cultivated for a maximum of 6 years and then never again for all time. That clearly was a temporary thing. And so it makes much better sense to understand Deuteronomy 15 and its sabbatical year letting drop of debts as a temporary thing for during the sabbatical year. And why? Because in that year, none of the Israelites were supposed to be working their ordinary work to support themselves. They were, and of course, this was an agrarian culture in which probably at least 95% of the people made their livings by farming. None of the people were supposed to be doing that. Well, if you were going to keep collecting on a debt during that year, then you were going to be forcing someone to work when the law of God said that he wasn't supposed to work. Instead, all the Israelites should enjoy that year off, and the temporary suspension of collecting debts would enable that to happen. Now, the Jubilee year law is discussed in Leviticus chapter 25, and there we're told that if someone if someone sold land, the land was to be returned to him in the year following the 7th sabbatical year. So that would be the 50th year. And some people have written that, see, this required an occasional redistribution of wealth because when someone sold land, it remained with the buyer only until Jubilee. Well, that is really to neglect the pretty obvious explanation of the chapter itself, because you're told there specifically two things. One, that the price of the land was to be calculated by multiplying the value of the annual harvests times the number of harvest years left until the next Jubilee. And so that means if there were 10 years left, you calculated the price of the land as 10 cultivable years, and that was the price. Well, that means that at the 50th year, the land goes back because the harvests in the intervening year have paid back the buyer the price at which he bought the land. And in fact, the text actually says it's really not the land you're selling, it's the harvests. So in essence, what's happening there is that the land is acting as collateral for a loan that has the term of the years remaining to Jubilee. And every year's cultivation from that land, every year's harvest from that land, and it's harvested by the buyer, pays the buyer back. So as of Jubilee, the whole loan is paid back. And of course, when the loan's paid back, collateral is returned. So there's no redistribution of wealth there either. And then there are a couple of New Testament passages that some people will appeal to as well. Jesus telling the rich young ruler that he should sell everything and give to the poor. Well, that clearly tells that you should not have anything extra. Well, except that in the very next chapter in the Gospel of Luke, as he records this, we have Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who, upon his conversion, announces that he is going to he is going to repay to anyone what he has defrauded him, and then also give half of his wealth to the poor. And Jesus specifically says that this man is a son of Abraham, that salvation has come to his house. That indicates not that he bought his salvation by doing this, but rather that this was a clear sign that he had been converted. So there's no forced redistribution of wealth there. And then in Acts chapters 2 and 4, we have the description of the early church in Jerusalem, where people had all things in common. No one said that anything that he had was his own, and things were given to the poor. People were selling land and houses and the like, and giving to the church to distribute to the poor. That, we're told, was communism. In fact, one communist writer, Jose Miranda, in his little book, Communism in the Bible, said this showed that communism was an absolute requirement to be a Christian. Well, not quite so fast. The text doesn't say that everyone considered other people's property to be his own. You know, that is, I couldn't say, well, my Christian neighbor, you have this, therefore I get it. No, it was instead, I think, well expressed in the Spanish saying, mi casa es su casa, right? My house is your house, my brother in Christ. If you have need, you can come and I will welcome you into my house. But it wasn't su casa es mi casa, as in, I get to come into your house anytime I want and you can't forbid me. That wasn't the point at all. Furthermore, the selling of land was an occasional thing. The Greek verb is in what's called the imperfect tense, and it denotes an action that happens again and again from time to time. And so rather than selling everything that they had all at once and giving all the return to the apostles to be distributed immediately, instead, people who had houses or lands would see a need and they'd sell something and they would give. And when Ananias and Sapphira lied about what price they had gotten for the land, Peter didn't rebuke them for not giving everything. He rebuked them for lying about how much they had given. And he even said to Ananias, while it remained, wasn't it your own? And even after you'd sold it, the money that you got for it, didn't you have authority over that? You've lied to the Holy Spirit. You haven't lied to men, you've lied to God. So the issue was not the requirement of renunciation of private property. It was instead the love shown and the grace shown. And that comes forth especially in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, where Paul writes about the collections for the saints in Jerusalem at a time of famine. And he roots everything in grace and love. He never uses the word justice. And so the aim for equality there, that's mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, is an equality not of economic outcome, that everybody has the same amount of money at the end, but rather this equality, that the saints in Jerusalem have, by sending missionaries, shared out of their spiritual abundance to those who once were without Christ. And now those who have Christ in the Gentile world and have a material abundance have their opportunity to share with the saints in Jerusalem who now face a material lack. So those are kind of the typical passages to which people will appeal, and none of them, properly understood, supports the notion of wealth redistribution.
Yeah, so Mikhail Gorbachev was wrong. Jesus wasn't the first socialist.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Now, yet it's an easy enough mistake for some people to make. Robert Higgs, who's actually an economist, much of whose work I admire, wrote in an article about 20 years ago or so, he referred to Jesus' instruction to the rich young ruler to sell everything and give to the poor, and said, so you see, Jesus was a communist or a socialist, and that's why I don't embrace Jesus. Well, I think it's actually that Robert Higgs misunderstood Jesus quite thoroughly.
Yeah. And so you mentioned justice just a minute ago. How does the Bible define justice? And what's the difference between justice and grace? Because we often get too mixed up, I think.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, in my researches back in the 1980s, looking at all the uses of the Hebrew and Greek terms and the contexts of them, I came up with this summary definition of justice. Justice means rendering impartially and proportionally to everyone his due in accord with the righteous standard that is God's moral law. So I look to the 10 commandments, all 10 of them, to their positive and negative implications, and see what they tell me I'm supposed to do in relation to others. And justice requires that. Any violation of those is an injustice. And justice requires impartiality, that is, all the rules apply to everyone equally. There are no favorites. There are no people who get special dispensations. Rather, the laws must apply to all equally. This is a principle that political philosophers call the rule of law. And the rule of law is not the same thing as the rule of laws, right? Just simply saying, oh, well, because the parliament passed this law, therefore this is in accord with the rule of law. Rather, the rule of law is precisely that principle that all laws must apply equally to everyone. And so when some laws are written in a way to favor certain persons, so that you can predict in advance what people are going to benefit from this law and what people are going to be harmed by this law, that law is actually contrary to the rule of law. So impartiality is one of the criteria of justice. Proportionality is another one. That is, rewards and punishments need to be proportionate to behavior. And if that's the case, then someone who works very, very intelligently and very, very diligently and provides benefits, goods and services to many, many people at prices that those people are willing and ready to pay, that sort of a person has behavior that ought to bring to it great reward. Whereas someone, who's lazy, someone who doesn't stretch his mind by study, somebody who therefore doesn't provide much benefit to others in the form of goods and services, is not due great reward for that. And justice recognizes those differences between us and therefore says that we cannot force equality of outcome. We can't even force equality of opportunity, because the time and place you're born and your own enjoyments, your preferences, your aptitudes, all of those things mean that different people have different opportunities. At 6 feet 5 inches tall, I had a much greater opportunity at birth. Of course, I wasn't 6'5" then, but by the time I reached my full height, I had a much greater opportunity to become a professional basketball player with a great high salary. I never did, by the way. Than somebody who was only 5 feet tall. You cannot equalize opportunity, you cannot equalize outcome without applying laws differently to people instead of the same to everyone. That's not just.
And so I think we obviously talked about the fact that the Bible doesn't condone sort of the socialistic understanding of the redistribution of wealth, but many Christians sort of have a real compassion for the poor. I know you do. So how should we understand our responsibility to the poor of the world as Christians?
Yeah, well, John Wesley is famous for once having said, "Get all you can, save all you can, give all you can." And this is what we as private persons can do. I should be maximizing my ability to produce wealth, and then I should be stewarding that wealth carefully so that it isn't frivolously frittered away. And then I should be giving generously from that wealth to those who are in need, particularly, especially to those who are in need through no fault of their own. You know, the Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10, if someone will not work, not someone who cannot work, but if someone will not work, don't even let him eat. That is, the person who refuses to work is refusing to exercise that aspect of the image of God, because God is a worker. We read that in Genesis 1 and 2, and he makes us to be workers too. Someone who refuses to work is basically wanting everybody else to support him, and that's selfish, and it goes against the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. But those who cannot work, those who cannot support themselves, we as Christians have a wonderful opportunity to give graciously to them. And this brings us, by the way, to the difference between justice and grace. Justice means rendering what is due. Grace means giving blessing, benefit, help, not only where it's not due, but contrary to its due. You know, when we read that we are, as Paul puts it in Ephesians chapter 2, by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, lest anyone boast. The point there is that grace is specifically a gift. It's not earned, it's not due at all. And it comes to us despite the fact that we are sinners. So when we look to the poor, it's not that any particular poor person can bring a lawsuit against me and say, you owe me $500 or something like that. It's that I look at the person in need, and responding as Jesus did, I should be moved by compassion to reach out and help that person in his need. And it might be that he actually really needs $500 or 500 pounds. It might instead be that he needs help in developing the habits of life, the patterns of life that will enable him to support himself and his family. So real love for the poor, real care, involves getting personally involved in their lives, and it might require a lot more donation of our time than of our money.
And what do you think the Christians' responsibility to a lot of people basically look to the government and say it's the government's responsibility to help the poor? Is that a right attitude for the Christian to have?
Well, I don't think that the Bible sees the government's role as one of taking wealth from some people to whom it belongs and giving it to other people to whom it doesn't belong. In Romans chapter 13, we read that the authorities of God, the authorities established or appointed by God, ordained by God, they are supposed to be servants of God to punish those who do evil, to execute vengeance upon those who do evil. And I think a biblical understanding of the state says that the proper use of that lawful monopoly of violent force, okay, that's one way of defining the state. The state is the lawful monopoly of violent force. Others cannot use violent force other than in self-defense. The state is the collection, the combination of the right of self-defense of all of us members of it. And so government exists to enforce justice, not to exercise charity. The church, or grace, charity and grace, the Greek word for grace is charis, from which we get our word charity. The church is the instrument of God's grace, and it doesn't go around arresting and punishing criminals, right? The state is the instrument of God's justice, and it goes around arresting criminals and punishing them. But the church can't use force. The state is by nature an instrument of justice, and for it to attempt to do grace is for it to violate the rights of some of its people. Government can only give to some what it takes from others, because government doesn't make wealth from nothing. It can only take from some through taxation. And so I would say that our churches need to be sure that they are exercising grace. And by the way, at least in the United States anyway, the data show me that if everyone who is a church member in the United States were actually to tithe rather than giving to their churches what typically is about 2% of their income, the church's revenues in the United States would be more than enough to lift every single person in America whose earned income is below what the federal government defines as poverty, which, by the way, I think is way above a biblical definition of poverty, but leave that aside for the moment. The church's revenues would be more than enough to lift everyone in America whose revenues were below the federal definition of poverty to about 50% higher than the poverty level. And that would still leave more revenues left over to the churches than what they currently get anyway. And so if we Christians were to take seriously our responsibility to tithe, and the churches were to take seriously their responsibility to be caring for the poor around them, essentially we could eliminate the need for government effort to do that sort of thing. So in large measure, I blame on Christians the growth of government to do that sort of thing, because we haven't been doing it as well as we ought to be.
There you go. For everyone watching, if we're Christians and you're thinking about how you should tithe them, there's a lot there to think about how much we should be given and the responsibility on us as Christians. There's a lot of people still watching, and some maybe have just tuned in. And so if you have any questions for Dr. Beisner on this issue of socialism, Christianity, then please do type something in the comment section and we'll try and get to it. And we have got a question from someone, Dr. Beisner, in India. And I think you grew up in India, is that right?
Well, I didn't grow up there. I lived there for a year as a toddler, but I have actually some very intense memories from there. And of course, it made a huge impact on my family, all of them older than I was. And so I learned much about it, and I have a very warm place in my heart for India, and I have a dear friend and a couple of dear friends who live there, solid Christian workers.
Yeah. Someone's written from India, and they've asked, can you please tell us about the main problems which is faced by Christians under socialism? And he's asked for in simple points.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure quite why this necessarily happens, but historically, what we've seen is that socialist countries tend to pretty severely restrict religious freedom. And that affects people of all religions in the socialist countries. But it seems historically to affect Christians most of all. And perhaps that's precisely because Christianity sees such a large role for the church in looking after the needs of the disadvantaged, of the poor around us. And yet, for socialism, the state is kind of everything. One way to look at socialism is as an idolatry of the state, turning the state into an idol. And the state is a jealous, God tells us, the Lord says, I am a jealous God. Well, all gods, I suppose, the false ones, are jealous too. And the state gets jealous of churches which divide the loyalty of their people. And so for that reason, we've seen historically that in socialist and especially totalitarian communist countries, religious persecution, especially of Christians, has been very, very common and widespread and intense. We've seen that in the Soviet Union, we've seen that in communist China, we've seen it in Cuba, in all of the East European communist countries before the collapse of the communist bloc. It just goes on everywhere. Totalitarians cannot abide competition.
Yeah, so they recognize the sort of antithetical, difference between the Christian worldview and the socialistic worldview, and they don't really want them to live together.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I can't see any more questions coming in. I can see a number of people coming in and thanking you for the presentation. So I'll maybe give people another minute. If anyone is watching and they want to ask something really quickly, we can try and get to that. But just to remind you of the booklet available from Dr. Calvin, Social Justice versus Biblical Justice, and you'll find a link to that in the comments section, and also the podcast that was recommended at the beginning, The Cold War, What We Saw. That'll give you a great historical overview of the history of communistic socialism. Would you like to take a minute, Dr. Beisner, maybe just to tell people about the work you do at Cornwall Alliance?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity. One way of putting it is that we're trying to save the planet from the people who are trying to save the planet. But I think a more nuanced way of putting it would be this, that we work to educate the public and policymakers on three things simultaneously and interwoven with each other. One is biblical earth stewardship, the second is economic development for the very poor, and the third is the Christian faith with the gospel and the biblical worldview and theology and ethics. On the first of those, biblical earth stewardship, what we try to communicate is that fulfillment of the dominion mandate of Genesis 1:28, in which God, having created Adam and Eve in his own image, blesses them and says to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything that moves on the face of the earth. This dominion should reflect God's own dominion seen in the earlier verses of Genesis 1, where God makes everything out of nothing. He makes light out of darkness. He brings order out of chaos. He brings greater order out of lesser order. He brings life out of non-life, and great variety and fecundity of life. And we should be mimicking that. So we summarize godly dominion as men and women made in God's image, working lovingly together to enhance the fruitfulness and the beauty and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and of our neighbors, so that really we're addressing the two great commandments, to love God and to love neighbor. The second is, as I said, economic development for the very poor. And our studies of both scripture and economic history persuade us that two things are indispensable for raising and keeping any entire society out of poverty. The first is a set of social conditions, social institutions, private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law. The second is access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy, because energy goes into absolutely everything that we do, making food, clothing, shelter, medical care, transportation, communication, everything, absolutely everything requires energy. And the more energy we can bring to bear, the more we can make. And that too is part of how we reflect the image of God, the maker. And unfortunately, much of the environmental movement sees economic development, economic growth, as antithetical to environmental stewardship. And history actually tells us, as well as common sense, I think, that the truth is the opposite. A clean, healthful, beautiful environment is a costly good. Therefore, wealthier people can afford more of it than poorer people can. And the history of economies and the history of environments shows that it is the wealthier economies that have done a better job and are doing a better job of ensuring clean air and water and the like for their citizens than the poorer economies. And then finally, the gospel and the whole Christian faith and worldview and so on, that's all relevant in that it's only as we understand the world, the way God made it to be, and it's only as we use it the way he intends us to use it, that we can actually enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the world, and that we can actually see whole societies rise and stay out of poverty. And not to mention, of course, the most important thing, and that is that individual souls will live on for eternity. And there are billions of people in the world right now who are at enmity with God, and they need to be reconciled to him. And the only way of reconciliation, the only name given among men whereby we must be saved, is the name of Jesus. He is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by him. But everyone who comes to him, he receives and he reconciles to God the Father. So we want to put all of these messages together and use them to bring the gospel and to bring flourishing to human beings all over the world.
That's great. And if you want to know where to, cornwallalliance.org, and Dr. Beisner also has a Facebook page. They're just Cornwall Alliance, the Stewardship of Creation.
Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation on Facebook. We also have a YouTube page, a YouTube channel, Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, where we have quite a number of videos that people can watch, as well as the many, many articles and major papers on our website, cornwallalliance.org.
Great. So make sure you go out and have a look at those. Dr. Beisner, we've had a few more questions come in. 3 questions. Can you answer those quickly for us?
Yeah, let me take a quick look over here, what they are. There's one from John. In American politics, there is now a big push to remedy income inequality. What is wrong with that notion? Well, first of all, it violates the principle of justice, of impartiality. You cannot use laws to take money from some people and give it to other people without playing favorites. But impartiality is one of the criteria of justice in the Bible. So that's part of what's wrong. Another part of what's wrong is that, frankly, it creates all the wrong incentives. If you take away from people what they produce and give it to other people, then you take away, you undermine their incentive to make more, which is one of the reasons why the higher tax rates go, the less productive people tend to be. If they're going to have a large part of their produce taken away from them forcibly by the state, well, they may just decide, I'd rather just relax. I'd rather go on vacation more. That's one part of it as well. I have one here from Colin. The response to the famine in Acts 11 seems to be the exemplary corporate church good work that Paul ran with consistently. Have you written on how we should apply lessons from that today? Yeah, I actually, although not specifically addressing Acts 11, where we see the history of that, we see Paul's discussion of it in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, and also a little bit of a reference to it in Romans chapter 15. And I discuss that in a section of my book, Social Justice versus Biblical Justice, How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. I also addressed it in a much longer book back in 1988 called Prosperity and Poverty, the Compassionate Use of Resources in a World of Scarcity. And the key things to keep in mind are that all of the giving was voluntary. None of it was forced. None of it was mandatory for being accepted in the church. It was voluntary, and it was driven, it was motivated not by justice, but by love and grace. Those are the terms that are really used there. Excuse me, somebody just tried to Skype me, and
hi, Cal.
And I failed to have that turned off. Sorry about that. So it's grace and love rather than justice that motivates. I see another question here from an Ian. Can you address in any way what seems to me the growth in acceptance or even support of socialism in the church in the USA? Not sure when you joined us, Ian, but we talked about that a little bit earlier. I think a large part of it has to do with younger generations lacking the historical perspective that older people have. If you didn't live through what is typically referred to as the Cold War, you haven't had direct experience of the incompatibility of socialism with freedom, with justice, with human dignity. And so a lot of what's needed, I think, Ian, is a learning of history, but even just simply a looking around at the world around us as it is right now. If you compare the freer economies with the less free economies, you find not only greater wealth and greater distribution of that wealth in the freer economies, you also find more freedom, more liberty, and more human thriving. So Winston Churchill one time said something like, if you're not a liberal when you're in your 20s, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative by the time you're 30, it's because you have no head. I wouldn't go quite exactly that far. I wouldn't take that in absolute terms, but there is something that seems compassionate on first blush about socialism. And it's only after you actually try it that you discover that no, it doesn't really work all that well. Let's see. Someone says, your point about cheap available energy reminded me of an episode of Connections, which mentioned the medieval industrial revolution powered by water in combination with water wheel and cam. Yeah, the whole history of energy is quite fascinating, and access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy is absolutely indispensable to lifting and keeping whole societies out of poverty. We addressed that at some length in a paper of ours called A Call to Truth, Prudence, and Protection of the Poor, 2014. The case against extreme climate policy grows stronger, something like that is the subtitle. You can find that easily enough at cornwallalliance.org under the Landmark Documents tab. So just click on Landmark Documents and you'll see A Call to Truth, Prudence, and Protection of the Poor, 2014. And I think that's it. So
that looks like
thank you very much, Simon, for having me on again.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Beisner. It's been great. I'm sure everyone has been blessed by what we've heard from